this might feel, sorry. Yeah, hi online folks. I'm glad that you got to watch the video of me saying quiet things. But you might imagine that you are reading this article and you don't know anything about it. This might be something that feels really difficult as you're going through it. On the other hand, you might find this experience of reading this BuzzFeed article to feel a lot easier. The language is easier, there's some nice photos, and it's written in a way that feels easy. And when information feels easy to process, it also feels more true. And sometimes ease of processing can be a valid cue that something's true. So something might be easy to process because the arguments flow logically. It fits together well. There's not these gaps in logic. Something might feel easy to process because it's consistent with what you already know. And so if you already knew a lot about the epigenomics of cancer, that might be something that's easier for you to process and understand. Something might feel easy to process because you've heard it before from a credible source. So when we see something one time and then we see it again, it feels easier to process. And that, if you heard it from somewhere credible, then going with that feeling could be a good cue. But you can also make information easier to process for reasons that are unrelated to truth. And so as psychologists like to do this, we like to run studies where we test these things. And so there's work that finds that if you write information in a font that's easier to read, then that information feels more true than when it's written in a more difficult to read font. Audio quality can affect how true something feels. And so there's work done by Newman and Shores where they took clips of TED Talks and they degraded them so you could still hear the information, but it was more difficult to hear in one condition. And when people heard scientists giving their research talks, they were more likely to believe the information from when the audio quality was better. They thought the research was higher quality, and they thought the researcher was a better researcher. So even though the actual content was the same, having worse audio quality made it feel like it wasn't as good of a talk. So online, if you don't like this talk, you probably should get higher quality audio equipment. The presence of photos can increase belief. And so there's work finding that if you include a photo with a claim and the photo is related to the claim, even if the photo doesn't add any more evidence for the claim, then people believe the claim more. And this is something called a truthiness effect after Colbert's truthiness. And then an effect I'm particularly interested in is repetition. And so hearing something multiple times makes it feel more true. And this is something called the illusory truth effect. And this is a very robust effect that there's like hundreds of studies testing this at this point. And this effect is much bigger than the other effects you saw. So there's effects of perceptual clarity and photos. Those effects are there, but they are often quite small and they require specific conditions to find. This illusory truth effect, quite large, holds up like almost all the time unless you unless you do very specific things. And so that's why I'm interested in this effect. And there's also work that has looked at the effects of repeating climate change misinformation. And so in this work, what these researchers did was they picked people who endorsed climate science, and they showed them two different types of claims. They showed them claims that were aligned with climate science. And so like sea levels around the world have risen nearly 20 centimeters in the last 120 years. And so this would be aligned with climate science. And they also showed them claims that were aligned with climate skepticism. And so here's a claim around emails from prominent climate scientists suggesting conspiracy and data manipulation. And so what they do in these studies is they ask people to read these claims. And then after a delay, which in this study was 15 minutes, they showed them these claims. And then they also showed them new claims that were aligned with climate science or with climate skepticism. So what people are seeing are a mix of these claims, some of them that they've seen earlier in the study, and some of them which they haven't seen before. And they're looking at how much more true do the repeated claims feel than the new claims. And they're seeing, for these people, does seeing these climate skepticism claims repeated increase belief in them, even though they're people who endorse climate science. And so here are the results. And so to walk you through, the higher is more true, and the repeated is the darker bar. And so when claims were science aligning, they found that people judged the repeated claims to be more true than the new claims. And they also found this when it was skeptic aligning. So both repeating climate aligning, scientists aligning and skeptic aligning claims increased truth in them, even among people who believed in climate change. So that is something that's concerning. And I'll note that some of these claims are true and some of these claims were false. And so they looked at that across true and false claims. So it is the case that repetition can increase belief in true claims as well as false claims. Okay, so I'm gonna switch gears a little bit here, and you're gonna see a question, and I'd like you to hold up the number of fingers that is the answer. You know, lots of twos. Okay, the answer here is 0. So Moses didn't take any animals on the ark. It was Noah. This is something, yeah, this is something called the Moses illusion, where, yeah, it's called the Moses illusion. Most people answer 2. So if you gave 2, don't feel bad. But it segues to this idea of intuitive versus analytical processing. And so we've talked about intuitive, this going with feelings. And then the flip side is the analytical processing. And so we as a default generally assume that information's true. So we generally start with assuming that the content reviewing is true, because it doesn't make sense to question everything that you come across. It's not something you can feasibly do. So when I'm telling you about where I went to grad school and where I currently work, you probably weren't questioning if I was lying to you about all of those things. Your natural default is to assume truth. And so we tend to nod along if things feel right. And so when you saw that question, Moses felt like it fit in there well. And so you just nodded along and answered it without more closely integrating or more closely interrogating its parts. And analytical processing requires motivation and cognitive resources. And so one way to get people to switch to analytical processing is to give them some kind of motivation. And so a reason why they might distrust the person or be suspicious of the source. So if something feels wrong, that can be a cue to switch to view things more carefully. So if you're reading something and you stumble and you're like, something's not right here, that can get you to switch. Explicit warnings, so being told that information is false or to watch out for something can get people to think more carefully. If you're suspicious for someone's motives, so if something's coming from a source you think has ulterior motives, that can get you to switch to be more analytical. And one thing I want to note here is that when it comes to climate change information, a lot of times things can just feel right. This idea of like, we are all out there experiencing the world. And so if we're not experiencing an increase in temperature, then claims about climate change might not feel as intuitive, whereas claims where climate change is not happening and you're looking around and you're not experiencing these, changes in temperature, then that can be more appealing. But as people are experiencing more and more of these climate-caused disasters, then that is likely to start to switch where you're actually being able to experience those things yourself. But I think that's an especially tricky part of climate change, is that it doesn't necessarily feel intuitive what the science is saying if you haven't experienced it or you don't understand the science behind it. Okay. So now I'm going to talk a little bit more about the criteria people use to judge truth. And so when people judge truth, there are 5 criteria that they tend to draw on, and people will typically draw on some, but not all of these. One is compatibility. So is this compatible with things that I already know? And you can think about someone's worldview or the set of beliefs that they have. Is that belief something that is consistent with other things that they already believe or know? Coherent, is it internally coherent? So if it's something where like that the logic follows from one sentence to the next. Credibility, does it come from a credible source? And I'll note here that what's a credible source is also going to vary from person to person. And so these criteria also, it's not necessarily that there's some standard for what is credible, but does it come from a source that is perceived to be credible? Consensus, is this something that other people believe? And then the last one is evidence. Is there supporting evidence? And so when you're thinking about the ways that make information feel true, something's going to feel true if it's compatible with what you already know, if it has internal logic, if you're hearing it from a credible source, if it's got consensus, and if it has evidence. But one thing to note here is that you can use intuitive or analytical processing to evaluate each of these criteria. And so I'll show you a couple examples. So if you were deciding whether or not a source was credible and you were evaluating the source, you could be intuitive and just think, does the source feel familiar and trustworthy? Or you could do an analytical evaluation, which is, does the source have relevant expertise? And so we can go with our guts when we're deciding these things as well. And similar to how information feels more true when it's easy to process, the more that you see a source, the more credible that source can seem. And so if you're used to watching a certain, a certain news source and are used to feeling like they give you credible information, then that source, when a source feels familiar, then that information can feel more trustworthy when it comes from that source. Oh yeah, or you could do the analytical. There's another one, is you can do some more analytical, which is actually going through and seeing, is there reasons why I should trust the source. Another criteria is consensus, and I am particularly interested in consensus, and you'll see that in a minute. But an intuitive evaluation of consensus might be just, does it feel familiar? If something feels familiar, then I'm more likely to have encountered something lots of times. And if I've encountered something lots of times, that's a good cue that lots of people might believe that. And so the more something feels familiar, the more other people that believe it. The analytical evaluation might be something like, what do my friends say? What do opinion polls say? And so actually looking at like, what is the data of what people believe? So I'm really interested in consensus because these perceptions do play a really important role in our own attitudes, beliefs, and behaviors. We often look to others to inform what we believe and what we do. But we rarely have access to the actual number of people who believe or know something. So in terms of being able to do that analytical evaluation, it can be really difficult with consensus, and especially with consensus around, if you're thinking about consensus around climate beliefs, you're not necessarily going to have access to actually what do the scientists say, what do other people say, unless you take the time to go through and look at the polls and figure it out yourself. And so what people often do is they draw on these cues, like how often they've heard something before and if it's familiar. And so in the absence of those numbers, people are going to be more likely to rely on feelings. And these feelings can also override other cues. And so people rely more on how familiar something feels rather than the source of that familiarity. So as a couple examples, there's some work that finds that if you ask one person for their opinion and they repeat it 3 times, or you ask 3 people for their opinions and you get an opinion from each of them, having one person report their opinions 3 times can increase your perception of how common that opinion is almost as much or as much as hearing 3 different people share the opinion. Now, theoretically, like hearing one person repeat their opinion doesn't give you a cue if more people believe it, but the more someone repeats something, the more likely people are to think that that view is shared by others as well. And so that feeling of familiarity, people can rely on that over actually looking at where that familiarity came from. Was it one source or three sources? And some of the work I've done, we find that just repeating information, so in this case, we use trivia claims, increases perceptions of how many others would believe that information or already know it. We call that an illusory consensus effect, similar to an illusory truth effect. Just repeating information increases your perceptions of whether it's common knowledge and whether other people would believe it. Yeah, so I want you to all think of give an estimate for what percentage of Americans you think are at least somewhat concerned about climate change. And this is like this study was done in 2021. So if you want to adjust it all, does anyone have any numbers for the percentage of Americans who said they were at least somewhat concerned about climate change if you took a representative sample from the US? Yeah.
36.
36. Any other numbers? Higher? How high?
80%.
80%? Other numbers?
65%.
65? Okay, so they in this study, they polled a bunch of people and they asked them that, and then they compared it to, pulled a representative sample, and then they compared it to another representative sample who had actually responded. And people estimated that 43% of the country was worried, but it was actually 66% of the country. And they found this for all us for as well, both for worried about climate change, but also they underestimated consistently people's support for different policies. And here they're reporting that 80 to 90% of Americans underestimated the prevalence of support for climate change policies and climate concern. And I'll show you the graph here. So these are different policies. So the top one is worried about climate change, and then support of carbon tax, renewable energy on public lands, 100% renewable energy by 2035, and the Green New Deal. Those red lines are the actual number of people who supported that. And then those plots that you're seeing are a plot of people's estimates. And you can see consistently that most people here are underestimating support for these policies. Let's see. Yeah, and so thinking about the reasons for that and thinking about this effect of repetition is that oftentimes the media gives climate change deniers a disproportionate amount of coverage. It's something called false balance reporting, and this idea of like, if you're going to talk to a scientist that believes in climate change, you also have to have the other side represented. And so then you get a scientist that doesn't believe in climate change. But even if 99 scientists believe it and 1% doesn't, now you're getting in your now you're getting what's presented is like a 50-50 split. And so you're getting disproportionately more of the less common views than you should be getting. And I think that's something I'm particularly interested in, is that the range of attitudes and beliefs that we're exposed to online oftentimes isn't representative of the actual rate of attitudes and beliefs out in the real world. And there's also one of the explanations might be that conservatives are presented as being against these climate change policies when actually many of them support it. So if you're making these estimates and you're like, well, most conservatives don't support climate change because you're doing this very like heuristic, then that is oversimplifying things and that it's not all conservatives. And so that's thinking about perceptions of consensus among peers, other Americans. I'm also interested in how people make judgments about scientific consensus. And we're particularly influenced by our perceptions of what experts believe. So expert source credibility is one of those truth criteria, and so is consensus. And so the scientific perceptions of scientific consensus can be particularly powerful. I have done some work where we looked at, does repetition increase estimates of scientific consensus? And does this effect occur when people are shown information without any source? So it's just repeating information with no source makes you think that there's greater scientific consensus for it. And we also asked, does a non-expert source repeating information increase perceptions that it has expert consensus? And so this is something that we tested in our study. And what we did was we took health-related claims, and some of them were true, half of them were true, half of them were false. And so we used claims like scabies are often spread in public swimming pools. That's a false claim. Ticks can cause paralysis. That's a true claim. And disposable chopsticks contain carcinogens. That would be a false claim. And so in a judgment phase, similar to the other truth effect study I showed you, so people saw 18 of these claims, and then there was a delay. And in the judgment phase, they then judged 36 claims. Half of them they had seen before, and half of them that were new. And we were looking at, did the claims they had seen before feel, were they judging them to have a greater scientific consensus than the new claims? So the DV, the dependent variable with scientific consensus. And so here's how you might respond. The prompt was, there's clear consensus in the scientific community that scabies have often spread in public swimming pools. And so if you had seen this before, this would be a repeated claim. If you hadn't, this would be a new claim. And in our first experiment, we didn't attribute the claims to any source, so people just saw them at exposure with no source. And then in experiments 2 and 3, participants were told that the claims either came from a Facebook group for parents, so non-experts, or a Facebook group for the Massachusetts Journal of Medicine, which would be experts. And I'll show you that prompt in a second. And in the third study, we added a long delay. And so it was over between exposure and judgment. It was, I believe, 2 to 3 days rather than a few minutes. Oh, let's see. Okay. I didn't show a picture of the different groups here, but just so you know, when we told them they were from the Facebook group from parents, we explicitly told them that it was not expert advice. And we told them that they were from people sharing their favorite health-related information they'd learned that year. And when it came from the Massachusetts Journal of Medicine, this was a closed group where you had to have credentials to be able to join that group. Okay. So we found across these studies that repeating these true and false claims increased perception that they had scientific consensus. And this occurred when the repetition didn't come from source information. So just seeing information with no source makes you think that it's got greater expert consensus. And we also found, concerningly, that when you see information from a non-expert source, that increases your perceptions that there's expert consensus. Reassuringly, also from an expert source, increased perceptions of expert consensus. And we found this both with a short delay and a longer 3 to 5 day delay. And one thing that is reassuring is that the effects of repetition on perceptions of consensus were greater when that exposure had come from an expert source. But even when information had come from a non-expert source, it increased perceptions of expert consensus. And so you can think about why this might be concerning if people are online or being exposed to information from people who have no relevant scientific knowledge, and maybe those people like to post a lot and you're seeing it a lot, and you might actually result in you changing your perceptions of what the experts believe. Yeah. And also to note here that this was just a single exposure to these claims. So just a single exposure to false claims can increase its perceptions of its consensus. People can be sensitive to the relevance of the source, but even seeing something from a source explicitly labeled as a non-expert can change perceptions of expert consensus. And thinking about here how our media environments play a role in this. Okay, so I'll give a little summary here, and then I'm gonna move on to like the kind of better part of like what things can help. But to summarize, why do we believe climate change misinformation? Assuming that information is true is the default. There might not be cues to analyze that information more carefully. It might feel consistent with what people already know about the world. You might encounter misinformation repeatedly when you are on social media and things are algorithmically tailored to you. If you're going to encounter some misinformation, then you're probably going to see more of that misinformation. And misinformation may meet or feels like it meets truth criteria, like source credibility or consensus. So it might feel like this information's got a lot of consensus behind it, but that might just be because you've seen it repeated a bunch of times. And you might also not remember use source information. And another thing to note too is that misinformation can be particularly sticky when you don't have a better way to explain something. And so this is the best explanation you got, then that can make it believable. Because if this isn't the case, then what else explains it? Okay, so now turning to the what can we do part. So given all this, what can we do? I like to note that fact-checking can be effective, and there's a lot of work out there that finds that consistently that fact-checking can be effective. This is something called the Debunking Handbook, which a bunch of experts put together to go through best practices for fact-checking to make it most effective. I'm gonna just highlight a few things here. One is that when you're correcting, whether this is you or this is also can just be a general how to correct this, you want to explain why the information's wrong. So if you're telling people that their misconceptions around climate change isn't correct, like, well, if it's, if climate change is happening, why was it so cold this winter? Actually explaining why climate change can make it feel more cold in the winter rather than just saying that's incorrect. And so if you are removing an explanation, you want to explain actually why that correction is wrong or why that information is wrong. You also want to make the truth feel true. All the things that can make false information feel true are also the things that make true information feel true. And so you want to present factual knowledge in a way that's compatible with your audience's prior knowledge. And so if someone holds a bunch of beliefs about climate change misinformation, then thinking about what information do you have to give them first for them to then for the information you're telling them to be compatible with that information, or thinking about what level of complexity or level of explanation makes sense so that something's compatible. You want to make your story coherent, drawing attention to source credibility and where information came from, if it's a source that you think that person will find credible, and then pointing to consensus in that information. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. And then sharing evidence for your claims. So these are all the truth criteria. And so thinking about ways in which you can, when you're making corrections, to appeal to that truth criteria is a good idea. There's also some alternatives to fact checking. And so in that, some of those earlier slides, one of the things I told you was that drawing attention to information truth can be a way to get people to think more carefully about that information. So anything that you can do to remind people that false information might be present before they view that information can be helpful. And so in some of the work I've done, we've tested the use of these questions that draw attention to truth. And so questions like, how do you know that's true? Where did you learn this? What's the evidence for that? These are questions that are appealing to truth criteria. We've tested whether if you have online posts containing misinformation and you add one of these replies, does that reduce other users' belief in it? And we've found that to be the case. So if there's misinformation online, just adding one of these questions, it can help other people who are viewing it not just accept it. So getting people to consider information truth when false information might be present is something that can be helpful without actually calling out the information as false. In some of our truth effect work, we found that just warning people that they're going to see some false information can reduce the impact of repetition. So just cueing people, giving people a reason to think about truth, to switch to that more analytical processing can be helpful without actually explicitly saying the information's false. And then also, rather than correcting, you can focus on the source credibility. So if something is not a credible source, pointing out like that's not a credible source can be a helpful way to reduce beliefs in the misconception without actually addressing, calling it out as false. And then also communicating about consensus. And this consensus piece has a good amount of work that's been done on it. And so in this paper here, they're looking at the effects of false balance reporting and then seeing if they can use consensus communication to address it. And so what they did in this study is they had participants read 2 interviews. One was from a source that held the view that global warming is occurring, and one from a source that held the view that global warming is not occurring. So that's similar to false balance, where you're getting one person from each side. And what they found was that when you get this false balance reporting, that resulted in decreased expert consensus compared to if they'd only seen the consensus view and then a control. So basically, by adding that non-consensus view, that's decreasing perceptions of expert consensus. And then in the second study, they provided people with something that they are calling here a weight of evidence statement. And so they told people here that, you know, you just saw these 2 different perspectives. This person believes it's occurring. This person believes it's not occurring. However, it is clear from a large number of quality scientific studies published in reputable journals that an overwhelming majority of researchers who are experts on climate science agree that climate change is occurring and is negatively affecting our planet. So you just saw the 2 sides, but then you're also getting this weight of evidence where, you know, actually a large majority believe in that climate change is occurring. And they found that adding that weight of evidence protected people from the effects of seeing the contrarian view. And it actually also helped people who hadn't even seen the contrarian view. So this consensus communication can be really powerful in addressing those misperceptions of consensus, as oftentimes people underestimate how strong the consensus is on these topics. So like with vaccination, people underestimate what proportions of doctors actually endorse vaccination. And with climate change, it's really, really a high number among the expert consensus. And so if you can correct those misperceptions, then that can help protect people from these, from this not seeing that content at the same rate at which people actually hold those attitudes and beliefs. And this was a meta-analysis that was done where they looked across at the effects of consensus messaging across 43 experiments. And they looked at messaging across climate change, genetically modified foods, and vaccination. And most of these were climate change ones. And so 33 of the 43 were studies that tested the effect of consensus estimates on climate change. And what they found was that across these studies, seeing that consensus messaging, and they just looked at for a single exposure, it increased scientific consensus with a effect size here, 0.55, which is like a medium effect size. And then it also increased belief in scientific facts. And this was a smaller effect size, but still significant. And that's just with one exposure. And so this communicating expert consensus is something that has a lot of support for being a useful way to address misperceptions of climate consensus. Okay, so some additional considerations. This talk did not address, like, this is a very complex topic with lots of different pieces involved. And so there is definitely more to this than what I showed you. It's important to consider that these beliefs occur within a broader system of beliefs. And especially with climate change science, people might be resistant to changing their beliefs because changing their beliefs can be scary, because the climate change can be scary and the implications of climate change can be scary. With climate disaster, it also, people may be motivated to not have to change their behaviors. And so there can be some motivation to maintain those beliefs because the alternative can feel really difficult. And in thinking about addressing these beliefs with people, when and how matters. And so this is thinking about if you're doing a one-on-one correction, it might be better to do it in a private space rather than a public space because it's really hard to admit that you're wrong, and it's difficult to admit you're wrong in front of other people. And so if you're trying to directly address someone, it can be better to do this in a place where it's not confrontational, it's not public. And so if you decide you want to address climate misperceptions with someone, considering that. Although you also might want to consider, are you actually trying to correct their beliefs, or are you trying to protect other people from believing it? And that's where, if you're on social media, then responding with the true information to protect other people could be a good idea. You also want to validate people. Like, there are a lot of people that believe misinformation, and it's part of the way our cognitive processes work. And so acknowledging that belief change is hard and validating other parts of that person, establishing common ground with that person first, like we are all in this together, we both have these shared goals, we want to both be able to keep, we want to keep the earth healthy, and so appealing to these shared values and goals rather than coming after it as like a me versus you is a good way to go. Yeah. And also, belief change takes time. One thing you saw that's really encouraging is that most people believe that climate change is important. We've had like a very big shift around climate change over time. And so beliefs do change, opinions about policies do change. This was a nice field experiment that I think is really positive, that to show that belief change can occur. And this is where they took people who were Fox News viewers and they incentivized them to watch CNN for a month. Like, they're like, we'll give you, I think it was $10 for every hour of CNN you watch up to this amount. And so people watched CNN, and at the end of the month, they had moderated their attitudes towards issues that they had seen were more moderate. And so, and thinking about that in terms of, I think this is something really positive, that a lot of beliefs do change, and a lot of it's due to exposure to the other side. And so making true information more prevalent and continuing to share true information is one of the best ways to address false information. And we have seen a lot of belief change in climate change. And I think one of the core pieces here is considering, how do we update people's misperceptions of consensus? And that is going to be an important route to go, rather than just how do we update beliefs, because we have updated a lot of beliefs. So just wrapping up, I gave you some reasons why people might believe climate change. And it feels familiar, it's consistent with what people already know, it feels like lots of other people believe it. And then some ways to address it, fact checking. I think a lot of this too is likely to come from the news media. So thinking about, how do we change the way that people are exposed to information online, providing people with consensus information along with that content. And so if there's ways in which you can communicate consensus, like that weight of estimate information, to have that come along with content people are seeing, that could be something that's useful. But if you're thinking about in your own day-to-day lives, like appealing to consensus, sharing true information, fact checking when you're fact checking, appealing to these truth criteria, those are things to consider doing. So I know you've all been waiting to know if this is true or false. It's true. I wasn't repeating misinformation. National Unicorn Day is April 9th, so you've got like almost 2 months to get prepared for that if you didn't have it on your calendar already. So thank you.
First of all, thank you. That presentation is really thoughtful. So I work with School of Education here. I work with teaching about climate change in K-12 settings. And I want to double check with you the consensus by the scientific community, because you mentioned it a number of times, but didn't give a number.
Yeah.
So what I usually tell educators is that it helps to tell K-12 students who are just beginning to think about climate change. It helps to tell them the scientific consensus, the level.
Yeah.
And so my understanding is that prior to like 2021, the work done by Naomi Oreskes from Harvard and others put it at about 97% of all climate scientists. And since 2021, there's been 2 meta-analyses done that have it at 99.9%.
I was gonna say, I believe it's 99 point something. So, and I wouldn't, yeah.
So that's correct.
I would fact check that exact number, but that feels correct to me.
Feels good.
It feels good. I believe it's 99 point something, but yeah. But yes, I believe that would be a good thing to do. And I think especially when you're teaching at that level, different ways of representing what does it mean for something to be 99 point something percent. And so like showing an array of 100 people and this is the one person, or showing it in some way like that with a graphic could be helpful.
If it's 99.9%, you can show
1,000. Yeah.
You can show 1,000 people.
Yeah.
1,000.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I have a chat on here as well. Oh, okay. I was just checking it wasn't a question. Yeah.
That's just referred to. I've heard that stat as well. Never actually looked into it to figure out if it's like that number of fraction of scientists agree that or moves across it, or is it just one?
So I'm not a climate change expert, so I think, yeah, but I think you'd get different results for is climate change occurring and is it something that's caused by humans? But I believe that like the human climate change caused is the 99 point something percent, that it is something caused by humans. But get a source before making that claim publicly.
I feel like I should know this.
Yeah. Yeah.
Wondering how much like the choice of medium affects how we get to consensus with messaging. Because that slide we had earlier about the study on Facebook, and I was like, I wouldn't believe anything on Facebook.
Yeah.
So I'm curious how much, and especially with AI coming down the pike and all the fake stuff, like does it work better with humans in real life? Does it really not matter if it's Facebook or Instagram or?
Yeah, I think all of those variables are going to be really important. It's going to be how much someone trusts that place. It's also people's perceptions of the information and how accurate they expect it to be. If it's somewhere where where your experience has been, you've gotten credible information from that source, then you might be easy and you might believe it more. I also am really interested in the kind of cues that people get in these different sources. And so I know when I'm online, the first thing I do is I look at the comments. Like I don't like looking at content if I don't know what other people are thinking about it. And I look to the comments to confirm my view or to, get a sense of what people are thinking. And so the ways in which the comments are sorted and what you think about how the comments are sorted. And so it's both the mediums themselves, but then how people perceive the mediums to be and whether they perceive that, things have been only things that are credible are posted, or if there's some kind of moderation, or so it is very contextual, both across different places and across people. And then also these things change over time. So like Twitter now is just X is just a mess. But so yeah, I think it's not really an answer, but it's complicated. Yeah. Yes.
Does the rise of like AI stuff impact the work a lot? Like I feel like my parents will send me like videos that are like really AI to me. And it's like that's just a small example. Like I feel like there's like a lot of misinformation that's AI related. Just really wondering how that.
Yeah, there's a lot of people who are studying AI and people's perceptions of deepfakes and the role of AI warnings and trust. I think it's tricky because things are changing so quickly. So both when I like a couple years ago, a lot of it was how do you spot a deepfake, and they'd actually train people like look for if someone has 6 fingers in the photo and look for the shadows, and that's like been very quickly outdated. And people also vary a lot in their trust in AI, and so it is a very hot topic. and it's tricky. And some of this concern is both, does, do people believe the AI content? But I'm also concerned about, does the AI content make people distrust true content? And does it make it so that people just don't trust anything? And so I think it's a good question. I also don't have a good answer for you besides it's complicated and changing quickly. And there are a lot of people at the center I work in that are specifically interested in AI misinformation. Yeah. Yeah.
How do you sort of fight the fragmentation you get online? Very specific communities, and then they'll sort of get this false consensus where everyone believes in place Facebook groups during COVID, or even if you want a physical example, I have elderly family members that live in the villages in Florida.
Oh, I've been there. Yeah. My Jewish grandparents had to leave the villages because they couldn't handle it. Yeah.
There, whether it's online or physically, or communities where everyone just forced, and there's no way to.
Yeah. And even too, I've had the experience of being in a community and it's one person repeatedly posting, but I don't realize that. And I'm like, wow, everyone in this group is having a real rough time with this problem. And I'm like, it's this one person. It's very tricky. There's media training that teaches you how to look outside these what they're called are walled gardens, is that social media makes it hard for you to go and check somewhere else because you have to go and leave the app and move somewhere else and search. And so you end up stuck in that one community. It's something I'm highly concerned about. And I think it's something with algorithms where you can consider let's integrate other ways of integrating other viewpoints, or if it's some kind of media, but the media is not incentivized to do that. So, I mean, maybe we just need to keep paying people to go to other communities. But I also, and I don't know if I'm not sure how to to encourage this or not, but I find it useful to go and look at counter-attitudinal places. So if I'm on Reddit, I go to conservative. And I think it is also helpful to remind yourself of what content other people are viewing. We don't know what information other people have, and there's a bias to assume that other people share more of the same knowledge with you than they actually do. And so there's work where they asked people they showed people news stories that had been on the media that they viewed, and they asked them how familiar they thought the other side was with those news stories, and people overestimated the extent to which the other side was familiar with those sources. And they found that overestimation was implicated in perceptions of perceived polarization. Because if you think about it, if the other side knows this information, but they're still acting the way they act, then I must really dislike them. And if you correct that the other side actually isn't familiar with that information, then that can reduce this perceived polarization. And so I think there's also for the purposes of animosity, I think it can be useful to see that the other side actually isn't getting the same content. And how do we get people to be aware that we are not starting from the same place? We're actually starting from getting fundamentally different sources of information. Oh yeah, someone asked about LLMs to trust information they hear. I think, yeah, I talked about that. Yes.
Thanks, Maddie.
Yeah. Yeah, thanks for having me.